What's up, everyone? Tera Roberts here with FantasyPros with 10 matchups to avoid for Week 17. Before I get into the list, if you've battled your way this far, you deserve a prize fit for a champion. So why not enter Trophy Smack's Ultimate Fantasy Football Championship Belt Giveaway? To qualify, simply subscribe right here to the FantasyPros YouTube channel and comment on any video this week. This custom championship belt isn't just a reward, it is a testament to your strategic prowess and season-long dedication. Make your victory unforgettable with Trophy Smack's ultimate symbol of fantasy football supremacy. And while you're at it, turn on notifications so you can be alerted when new episodes are up and to claim your prize. Now let's go ahead and dive right in. Tony Pollard versus Detroit. At this point, I ought to reserve a spot weekly for Tony Pollard because he is a permanent member of my matchups to avoid. There are some running backs, elite running backs, who can persevere through bad matchups. Tony Pollard just might not be one of those running backs. Pollard has flopped 2 straight weeks against Buffalo and Miami for a combined 13 fantasy points. He struggled before that against Philadelphia and he was saved by receptions, and this week, he gets Detroit, another terrible matchup for running backs. Receiving work is the only thing that can save Tony Pollard in this matchup, but that has become less of a guarantee, and you just can't trust him. Next up, Tua Tagovailoa versus Baltimore. Tua didn't actually have a bad game last week against Dallas, but the Dallas defense has been going through some struggles recently, and Tua having a solid performance wasn't really surprising. But that solid performance was fine for real football. For fantasy football, it's just not good enough. Tua finished outside the top 20 in quarterbacks in Week 16, and that was with 24 completions on 37 targets for nearly 300 yards, but only 1 touchdown. And there's the issue. Because Tua has 0 rushing upside, he simply isn't putting up the volume and touchdowns to be a QB1 in fantasy football. And this week, he gets a horrible matchup in the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens defense is clicking on all cylinders, and we just watched them destroy Brock Purdy. He had his worst performance of the entire season. I just can't imagine a scenario in which Tua gives us a top 10 performance this week. Avoid. Calvin Ridley versus Carolina. With CJ Beathard likely starting at quarterback this week, Calvin Ridley is a very risky option. We've talked about this in previous weeks. Carolina's secondary has consistently shut down quarterbacks throughout the entire season, and the way that most quarterbacks and receivers have been able to thrive is from efficiency, not volume. Efficiency just really hasn't been the Jags' strong suit, and Ridley's best games have been the result of volume. The likelihood of him having a strong performance off of limited targets is very slim. The Jags should lean heavily on the ground game and limit pass volume here. Ridley has been a volatile player all season long, and you could be looking at one of those 5 fantasy point performances from Ridley this week. Joe Mixon versus Kansas City. Running backs aren't a complete no-go against Kansas City. Zamir White thrived against them, but oddly enough, the Raiders seem to have some kind of edge on the Chiefs, with both Zamir White and Josh Jacobs having the 2 best games allowed by Kansas City this season. I'm not even joking. White and Jacobs are the only 2 backs to have had over 100 yards on the ground against the Chiefs. But as a whole, the Chiefs' defense has been a difficult matchup for opposing running backs. Add the difficult matchup to the fact that we're seeing a bit of a dip in usage over the past couple of weeks for Mixon, and we've potentially got a volatile situation. Mixon is still the clear lead back here, don't get me wrong, but rookie Chase Brown has been working his way into the mix just enough to really take away that massive volume that we were seeing earlier in the season from Mixon. And it's been volume both on the ground and through the air that has diminished here. There's also the little issue of the Bengals defense struggling and this being a potential get-right game for Patrick Mahomes. If the Bengals are playing from behind, we could see them continue to lean more into the receiving work for Chase Brown. Mixon's floor is fairly safe, but if you're an underdog this week looking for a high upside play, Mixon could easily let you down. Gardner Minshew versus Las Vegas. To put it simply, the Raiders' defense is not the same Raiders' defense that we saw earlier in the season. With defenses, we can't just look at the season as a whole. Teams like the Raiders and Chicago might have struggled earlier in the season, but now those defenses are wildly different. Head coach Antonio Pierce has the Raiders operating at a completely different level, and this matchup just isn't a high upside matchup for Gardner Minshew. This is a difficult week here for streaming options at quarterbacks with all of the changes happening around the league. If you are forced to start Minshew, I'm not judging you, but Minshew is a player whose floor is legitimately 6 fantasy points and his ceiling, excluding that one random game where he had multiple rushing touchdowns, is just 20 fantasy points. Minshew simply isn't a league-winning play. He does get Michael Pittman back, and that is fantastic, but you're still looking at 15-ish fantasy points in a championship week game. That's just not going to cut it. Before I dive into my top 5 matchups to avoid, are you one of many sports fans who are not ready for this fantasy season to end? Then you have to play Smashup Fantasy Sports, the fastest growing game out there. In Smashup, your fantasy team gets supercharged by Smash Cards, which are like video game power-ups that you pick to boost the scores of your players or even your entire team. Think your kicker is going to have a big game? Then choose Big Kick Energy to power them up. Are you starting Justin Fields? Then play Scramble Spikes to score more from his running. Paired with cool visuals, Smashup is the biggest innovation in fantasy sports in a very long time and really feels like it was designed for sports fans. And here's the best part. You can play for free and win fantastic prizes. No credit card needed, no hidden fees. All users receive 3 entries per week, but with our code FantasyPros, you'll unlock a 4th entry every week through the Super Bowl. So enter now at smashupsports.com and join the future of fantasy. Cil Herbert versus Atlanta. Be very, very wary of leaning aggressively into Khalil Herbert this week. Last week was fantastic. 20 carries for 112 yards, his biggest workload on the ground this season, and just the 3rd time that he has exceeded double-digit fantasy points. But beware, he didn't dominate in terms of time on the field. His snap count was fairly even with Roschon Johnson, and Donta Foreman looks like he'll be returning this week. This week could be a drastically different story for Herbert. And this matchup against Atlanta is very different from last week. Arizona was an ideal matchup. Atlanta is far stronger against the run, and when I say far stronger, I am talking Jonathan Taylor was the only running back to score a rushing touchdown on Atlanta so far this year. And since receiving touchdowns aren't in Herbert's wheelhouse, this is a recipe for disaster. Bad matchup, more competition in the backfield, just one big no-go. Kenneth Walker versus Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's defense has been a bit of a mixed bag all season, particularly because injuries have played a role in their overall performance. And I've got some concerns around Kenneth Walker this week. Walker is a volume back. He needs 15 plus carries and touchdown opportunities to thrive from a fantasy perspective. Last week in a difficult matchup against Tennessee, he got the carries with 16 total, but without a touchdown, his fantasy points sat at 6.6, a massive letdown for fantasy managers. His receiving work just isn't consistent enough to safeguard against bad matchups. Without a touchdown, you're lucky if you even get 10 fantasy points out of Walker. And that's the big issue here. Getting touchdowns on the ground against Pittsburgh has been an issue for opposing running backs. Over the past 4 weeks, James Conner is the only back to have scored on the ground against Pittsburgh. James Conner versus Philadelphia. This is risky because it is hard to script James Conner out of a game. This is more of an option in shallow leagues only. Conner can lead with volume on the ground, or he can make up for lack of volume through the air. And he's on quite a hot streak here with 3 straight games above 17 fantasy points. This week's matchup with Philadelphia is concerning though. Over the past several weeks, Philadelphia has been vulnerable against the run, but there is a reason for that. They have been dealing with injuries, most notably to Zach Cunningham. Since his injury, there has been a stark difference in Philadelphia's run defense. It is very possible that Cunningham returns this week, and if he does, we could be looking at the previous version of Philadelphia's defense, a version where running backs absolutely weren't scoring on the ground. Again, in deep leagues, sitting a volume back is probably something that you can't afford to do. But in shallow leagues, monitor practice reports and pivot if Cunningham is back. Alvin Kamara versus Tampa Bay. Again, with defenses, you have to look at them for what they have done recently and try to isolate why they've been better or worse than they traditionally were earlier in the season. With Tampa Bay, they were very solid against the run, and they were a defense that you definitely wanted to avoid before they kind of hit a rough patch with a couple of strong performances from opposing running backs. But they bounced back over the past couple of weeks, holding Packers running backs to a total of 59 rushing yards, and then Travis Etienne to just 12 rushing yards last week, and that is because they are actually healthy now. A healthy Tampa Bay defense is a no-go against the run. It's been a while since we've seen Alvin Kamara very successful on the ground. On top of that, he's dealing with an illness. He's at risk of just another disappointing outing this week. Saquon Barkley versus the LA Rams. The idea of sitting Saquon Barkley does sound like a complete nightmare. I get it. We start our studs in championship week, but this stud does come with risk. The LA Rams defense has been very clearly strong against the run, and they push everything to the pass. It has been consistent and it has been reliable. There is no way to sneak around it. And they don't give a ton of receptions up in yardage to opposing running backs either. This is just a bad matchup. If you have another running back in an advantageous matchup, you might have to make the difficult choice here and pivot away from Saquon Barkley. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to FantasyPros. And remember, if you've battled your way this far, you deserve a prize fit for a champion. So why not enter Trophy Smack's Ultimate Fantasy Football Championship Belt giveaway? To qualify, simply subscribe right here to the FantasyPros YouTube channel and comment on any video this week. This custom championship belt isn't just a reward, it is a testament to your strategic prowess and season-long dedication. Make your victory unforgettable with Trophy Smack's ultimate symbol of fantasy football supremacy. And while you're at it, turn on notifications so you can be alerted when our new episodes are up and to claim your prize.